Orientalism and Occidentalism. These two terms, which mirror each other, obviously refer to the idea of the sun. The Orient is where the sun rises for people in the West, and the Occident is where it declines. And so it is about the great differences between the East and the West. And it's a subject which has intrigued me all my life, perhaps partly because I was born in the Orient, as it were, that is in Assam in India, and spent a few years there, and subsequently most of my anthropological work, in fact all of it, has been in the Orient, in Nepal, Japan, China. And so I've been intrigued by how different those places are from the place I was educated and brought up in England. And much of anthropology is concerned with those sorts of issues about the other. How do we construct or make the other? What about us and our needs and our assumptions do we project onto the other? And this idea of projection of your own prejudices and hopes and dreams onto the other is the theme of perhaps the most famous book on this subject by Edward Said, Orientalism, which I think came out in the late 70s, early 80s. And when it came out, it was very widely discussed, and people were very excited about it, as I was, because what he did simply was to look at Western literature, particularly novels and, to a certain extent, poetry, not much philosophy, but particularly fiction, and see how the writers, particularly, he took the period from the middle of the 19th century up to the 20th century, and how they constructed an image of the Orient. And the central theme was that they made it female, supplicant, weaker, vaguely erotic, desirable, and this was to suit their needs and didn't have much relation to what the Orient really was. And this was the work of a Palestinian looking from the Middle East, and it was well written and interesting. And the first time I read it, I thought it was amazing. Subsequently, thinking about it and rereading it, I've seen an increasing number of flaws, which many people have also pointed out. Among them, his very limited use of sources. He uses literature, he uses a bit of poetry, not much philosophy, but none of the other arts. I mean, you can treat this subject without looking at, for example, painting, which is very, very revealing, or other art forms, is very restrictive. The second is his idea of the Orient is very peculiar, because for most people the Orient starts mainly in the Far East, that is maybe India. Certainly it's much to do with the Far East, India, China, Japan, that sort of area, Southeast Asia, whereas Said doesn't go beyond Palestine, really. I mean, the Middle East, Turkey, and Syria and so on. And so he leaves out, there's nothing much on India and certainly nothing on China and the rest. So it's restricted in those sorts of forms. And also it's a very simplified model of the literature, partly because it starts late. The important part for the study of the Orient, really, in the true sense of Orient, i.e. the Far East, is the 18th century with the huge love of Chinese objects, and then later Japan. So it's a start, but it doesn't get very far and is not very satisfying. But it points us in the direction of thinking about what it is that we want out of these other countries. And that is important to think about, particularly for an anthropologist, because when he or she goes to another culture, they think they come with an open mind and no particular prejudices and so on. But what Said and everyone now realizes is that we come with a whole lot of what in the cliché is called intellectual baggage. We come not with actual large suitcases of baggage, but mental concepts constructed by our own background and upbringing, which we then foist onto the other, and we make them into things which they aren't. And this kind of Orientalism continues to this day. I've written a book on the Chinese, understanding the Chinese A to Z, for example, and the first half of the first parts of the first few chapters are about the Western image of China and the way it became distorted and completely unrelated to reality, and very negative, and made a parody of what the Chinese really are. And this has continued. It starts even in the early representations in Montesquieu and so on, but it goes through the 19th century more and more negatively, and then a positive period for a short time towards the end of the 20th century, but now negative again. All our media filled with projections of how we fear, dislike, etc. the Chinese because of their policy and wherever it is. And so we really need to examine ourselves. And it's understanding our own projections, which is behind the quest to understand Orientalism. And another development is the idea of Occidentalism. I should say that one extension of the idea of Orientalism that is very intriguing is the work of Jack Goody, and he wrote a book explicitly on this called The East in the West, in which he looked at how China and Japan and East Asia were represented in Western sources. And he wrote another book about Islam, which has similar themes, because Islam is the great other for much of European history. And he shows that we have projected ourselves and discounted much of the greatness of Islam because of our fears through the ages. And he looks at China and Japan. Again, a very insightful and interesting book, though again flawed. For example, he makes no distinction really between Japan and China, sees them as the same, which of course they're not at all. He also refers to and is interested in Occidentalism, which is the way in which the East thinks of and represents the West. And here again is a vast area for fascinating work, because just as we have projected our hopes and dreams and fears onto the other in the East, so many people in the Third World and recently particularly China have projected their hopes and dreams. And for a while, for instance, in the end of the 20th, early 21st century, that dream was America, and it has long been America. And even for the British, America was a form of the other, Occidental, to the West. And so the Chinese have been in love with all sorts of American things, just as other countries like Russia for a while was filled in the late 19th and parts of the 20th century with a passion for Western things, as was Japan in its Meiji period. When it started to industrialize, it imported a great deal of Western thought, Western things, through the particularly the work of a man I wrote a book on, Fukuzawa Yukichi, whose name was allied to Western things. Fukuzawa Bon were Western new things. And so Japan imported wholesale technologies and military systems and legal ideas and so on from parts of the West. So this travelling back and forth between East and West has been one of the main themes of world history. And now that much of history has to be world history because the world is so united, so small, so connected, the themes of trying to disembed what are the ways we are viewing the other, how we construct the other, come to love them or hate them or whatever, those are subjects which really all intelligent, educated people in each civilization should learn something about, so that they don't wallow in just blind prejudice, which can lead to hatred and dislike if it's not examined and you don't look to see why you are feeling these negative and other times positive emotions.